My name is Judith Mercer. I'm 68 years old, and for 34 years I worked as a probate court clerk in Vermont, where I learned that people rarely show you who they truly are when life is easy. They show you when money, property, and family history sit on the same table. I've spent decades watching brothers sue sisters. Children fight their parents. Widows lose homes they believed were safe. One lesson stayed with me longer than any other. Documents don't betray you. People do. I never imagined that one day I'd become the woman sitting on the other side of the courtroom story. It happened on the night my family celebrated the 65th anniversary of the inn my late husband, and I spent most of our lives saving. That evening, my own daughter looked me in the eye, smiled politely, and said, "Mom, tonight it would look more professional if you stayed behind the reception desk instead of sitting with the owners." She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She simply believed I'd accept it. Cruelty doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it wears pearls, smiles for photographers, and lowers its voice just enough that everyone else can pretend they didn't hear it. I heard every word. So did my son-in-law, Daniel. So did his business partners. So did the mayor. Most importantly, my granddaughter Emma heard it. She froze halfway through placing champagne flutes on a serving tray, staring first at her mother, then at me. The ballroom inside the Ashcroft Inn glowed with warm candlelight. A jazz quartet played beside the massive stone fireplace Richard had rebuilt with his own hands almost 40 years earlier. Fresh pine garlands hung from every staircase. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished oak floors. The scent of cedar, cinnamon, and fresh bread drifted through every hallway. Every decoration had been chosen by me. Every guest list had been reviewed by me. Every anniversary menu had been approved by me. I'd spent nearly 4 months organizing that celebration. The local newspaper called it one of the biggest community events of the year. People had driven from 3 different states to attend. Many of them had stayed at the inn for decades. Some still remembered Richard carrying luggage himself because we couldn't afford staff during our first years. Others remembered me baking blueberry muffins before sunrise because hiring a baker would have meant missing another mortgage payment. This building wasn't just a business. It was our entire marriage, built one repair, one sacrifice, and one impossible winter at a time. Richard used to joke that we hadn't bought the Ashcroft Inn. We married it. He wasn't entirely wrong. When we purchased the property in 1984, it was nearly condemned. The roof leaked. Half the guest rooms couldn't legally be rented. The porch leaned several inches toward the road. The heating system belonged in a museum. Everyone told us we'd lose everything. Richard smiled anyway. "We're not buying a building," he'd said. "We're saving a story." For 42 years. That's exactly what we did. We painted every room ourselves. We refinished every floorboard ourselves. When money ran out, Richard worked construction during the day and repaired the inn at night. I handled bookkeeping, reservations, taxes, payroll, weddings, funerals, family reunions, and every guest complaint imaginable. Eventually, people stopped calling it the old Ashcroft place. They simply called it the Ashcroft Inn. Our inn. Or at least, that's what I believed. Richard passed away 3 years before the anniversary celebration. A sudden heart attack while pruning the apple orchard behind the carriage house. One minute, he was complaining about the weather. The next, he was gone. After the funeral, Rebecca insisted she wanted to help keep his dream alive. Daniel agreed immediately. At the time, I believed they were trying to support me. Now I understand. Sometimes people don't step in because you're grieving. Sometimes they step in because grief makes ownership easier to blur. I noticed small changes at first. Rebecca stopped introducing me as the owner. Instead, she would say, "This is my mother, she still lives on the property." Daniel started referring to the inn as our business whenever speaking to suppliers. Then investors. Then reporters. I corrected him once. He laughed. "It's just easier for marketing, Judith." Marketing. Such a convenient word. Almost as convenient as family. I should have paid closer attention. Because the first thing people rewrite isn't history. It's language. And by the time language changes, everything else usually follows. I ignored those warning signs because I trusted my daughter. That was my first mistake. My second was believing the celebration I'd spent months planning would remind everyone exactly whose dream they were honoring. Instead, it became the night my family decided to show me exactly where they believed I belonged. And waiting quietly inside my leather handbag was a folder that could change every one of their lives. The folder in my handbag wasn't a will. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't even a contract. It was something far more valuable. It was permission. For nearly 8 months, I'd been working quietly with my attorney, Eleanor Brooks, and the Vermont Historical Preservation Council. Richard and I had talked about it for years, but we never found the right time to put it into writing. After he passed away, I finally did. The Ashcroft Inn wasn't just another profitable country hotel. It had become part of the town's history. Thousands of families had celebrated anniversaries there. Hundreds of couples had been married beneath the old maple tree overlooking the valley. Children who once chased fireflies across our gardens now returned with children of their own. Buildings like that don't belong only to one family. They belong to memories. I wanted to make sure they stayed that way. The documents inside my bag created a protected historic trust. The inn could never be demolished. It could never become luxury condominiums. It could never be sold to a development company chasing another profitable ski resort expansion. Rebecca would become the managing director. She would receive an excellent salary. She would continue running daily operations. Emma would one day inherit stewardship of the property. Everything had been carefully planned. No lawsuits. No uncertainty. No family arguments. Richard would have approved every page. I intended to present the documents after dinner. I even imagined the moment. I'd stand beside the fireplace, where Richard always welcomed anniversary guests. I'd tell everyone how proud he would have been. Rebecca would probably cry. Emma would hug me. The mayor would congratulate our family for protecting one of Vermont's oldest inns. Daniel would have nothing to argue about. That was the future I believed I was walking toward. Hope is a peculiar thing. It convinces intelligent people that love automatically guarantees gratitude. Life has corrected me on that point. The anniversary celebration began just before 6. Guests filled the ballroom. Old friends embraced. Former employees stopped to tell stories about Richard. One elderly couple proudly announced they'd spent every anniversary at the Ashcroft Inn for 28 consecutive years. Moments like that reminded me why all those sleepless nights had been worth it. Then I started noticing details that didn't feel right. Daniel was introducing himself as the owner. Not manager. Not operator. Owner. Several guests congratulated him on his beautiful property. He accepted every compliment without correcting them. Rebecca stood beside him smiling. Not once did she interrupt. Not once did she say, "My parents built this." She simply accepted the version of history Daniel preferred. It was subtle, almost invisible. But I'd spent 34 years reading legal testimony. People reveal themselves long before they realize they're speaking. Then came another surprise. Near the ballroom entrance stood 2 sharply dressed men I'd never met. Daniel waved them over. "Judith," he said cheerfully, "I'd like you to meet Michael and Grant." Both shook my hand politely. "Pleasure to finally meet you," one of them said. "We've heard wonderful things about the property." The property. Interesting. Not the anniversary. Not the history. The property. Daniel placed a confident hand on my shoulder. "They specialize in hospitality development." Development. Another interesting word. I smiled politely. "And what exactly are you developing?" One of the men laughed. Oh, we're just exploring future opportunities. Future opportunities. Daniel quickly changed the subject before either man could continue. For most people, the conversation would have ended there. Not for me. Court clerks spend entire careers learning to notice conversations that stop too quickly. Later that evening, while guests gathered for photographs outside the ballroom, I passed the library on my way to the reception desk. The heavy oak door wasn't completely closed. Inside, I heard Daniel speaking. She'll sign eventually. Another man's voice answered. What if she refuses? Daniel chuckled. She won't. She's sentimental, not difficult. We just need to get through tonight. I stopped walking. Every instinct I developed during 3 decades in probate court told me not to move. The second voice lowered. The investors want an answer before the end of the month. Daniel sounded completely relaxed. They'll get one. The land alone is worth 4 times what the inn earns every year. Land. Not history. Not family. Not memories. Land. I quietly stepped away before they opened the door. Outside, the applause began. The anniversary ceremony was starting. I reached into my handbag and lightly touched the folder. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about giving it away. I was wondering if someone had already decided it belonged to them. And a few minutes later, my daughter would point toward the reception desk and tell me exactly where she thought my place was. The ballroom erupted in applause as Rebecca stepped onto the small stage beneath the grand staircase. A spotlight settled over her. She looked beautiful, confident, poised. She had inherited Richard's smile. For one brief moment, I saw the little girl who used to help me fold towels behind the laundry room because she insisted she was working at the hotel. I wanted that memory to stay. It didn't. Thank you all for joining us tonight, Rebecca began. The Ashcroft Inn has been part of this community for 65 wonderful years. Another round of applause. She smiled toward Daniel. We're honored to continue its legacy for future generations. We. Not my parents. Not my father. Not my family. We. Each sentence quietly moved history another inch away from the truth. Daniel stepped beside her. If Richard were here tonight, he said, I know he'd be proud of everything we've accomplished. Everything we've accomplished. I looked around the room. Several longtime guests exchanged uncertain glances. Mrs. Henderson, who had stayed at the inn every autumn since 1992, frowned slightly. She knew exactly who had restored this place. So did half the room. But no one interrupted. People rarely interrupt polished lies. They're too busy admiring how comfortably they're delivered. Daniel continued. The next chapter for the Ashcroft Inn is going to be exciting. That sentence caught my attention immediately. Next chapter. The hospitality industry is changing. We have incredible opportunities ahead. Opportunities. There was that word again. We're committed to making sure this property reaches its full potential. Property. Not inn. Not home. Not legacy. Property. Emma looked toward me. She noticed it too. Our eyes met across the ballroom. She looked confused. I simply smiled. Sometimes grandchildren understand more than adults give them credit for. Dinner service began moments later. Servers carried trays of roasted Vermont chicken, maple-glazed carrots, fresh sourdough bread, and apple cider reduction. The menu had been Richard's favorite. I'd insisted on keeping every recipe exactly as he'd loved it. I carried my own plate toward the ballroom. Then I stopped. There wasn't a place setting with my name. Not one. Every chair around the head table had a handwritten place card. Mayor Collins. Daniel Foster. Rebecca Foster. Michael Lawson. Grant Ellison. Members of the Historical Society. Even the local television host. My chair didn't exist. Instead, someone had placed a small round table beside the reception desk. One chair. paper napkin, a bottle of water. No wine glass. No centerpiece. No guests. Rebecca walked over before I could say anything. "Mom," she said softly, "would you mind eating here?" I looked at the lonely table. "Why?" She hesitated. Daniel answered for her. "We need someone greeting late arrivals. There are still people checking in." I looked toward the ballroom. 3 employees stood behind the front desk. 3. None of them appeared particularly overwhelmed. "You already have staff," I said. Daniel smiled patiently. "Guests love seeing familiar faces." Then Rebecca added the sentence that finally stripped away every illusion I'd been protecting. "It just looks more professional if the owners stay together." Professional. Owners. Stay together. The words hung in the air. "So," I asked quietly, "I'm not one of the owners tonight." Rebecca sighed. "Mom, please don't make this difficult. Not don't make a scene. Not I'm sorry. Just don't make this difficult." Emma suddenly stood from her chair. "What are you talking about?" Every nearby conversation stopped. Rebecca's face tightened. "Emma." "No," Emma replied. "Grandma owns this place. I've seen the old pictures. Grandpa built half of this building himself." Daniel forced a small laugh. "No one is saying otherwise. Then why isn't she sitting with you?" Silence. The kind of silence that spreads through a room before anyone realizes they're witnessing something important. Several guests turned toward us. Forks stopped moving. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Rebecca glanced nervously toward the investors. Toward the mayor. Toward the reporter. She cared far more about what they were seeing than what I was feeling. Finally, she leaned closer and whispered, "Mom, please. Don't embarrass us." "Us." "Not yourself. Us." I looked around the ballroom one last time. At the photographs covering the walls. At the staircase Richard had rebuilt after the fire of 1998. At the front desk, where we'd spent countless nights checking in exhausted travelers. At the brass bell Emma used to ring as a little girl. Everything in that building carried a memory. Everything. Except the future my daughter had already written without me. Slowly, I reached into my handbag. My fingers touched the thick folder. The trust agreement. Richard's handwritten letter. Every signed document. I could walk onto that stage. Reveal everything. Shock every person in the room. Part of me wanted to. But 34 years inside probate court had taught me something. Never make permanent decisions during public emotion. Facts are strongest when spoken calmly. I closed my handbag. Left the folder inside. Looked at Rebecca. Then at Daniel. "I understand," I said. Both of them visibly relaxed. They thought I'd accepted my place. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because at that exact moment, I decided the celebration would continue exactly as they wanted. But the future they believed was waiting for them had just quietly disappeared. I smiled. Not because I was happy. Because I had finally stopped expecting the evening to become something it never intended to be. Rebecca let out a quiet breath of relief. Daniel gave me the same satisfied nod I'd seen attorneys give after convincing someone to sign the wrong document. He thought the difficult part was over. It hadn't even begun. "I'll be at the reception desk," I said calmly. Rebecca squeezed my arm. "Thank you, Mom." "Thank you." Interesting. It was the first grateful thing she'd said to me all evening. Unfortunately for her, it arrived about 20 minutes too late. I walked across the lobby without looking back. Guests smiled as they checked in. Some congratulated me on the anniversary. Others thanked me for years of wonderful memories. One elderly gentleman reached across the counter and took both of my hands. "My wife and I celebrated our honeymoon here in 1987, he said. "We came back every 5 years. Richard always remembered our names." I smiled. He never forgot a guest. The man nodded. Neither did you. Those simple words almost broke my heart. Because strangers remembered my place in the inn, while my own family had quietly erased it. The anniversary dinner continued behind the ballroom doors. Laughter drifted through the hallway. Champagne glasses clinked. A standing ovation echoed after Daniel finished another speech. I didn't need to hear the words. I already knew the story he was telling. About vision. About growth. About the future. None of which belonged to him. Around 8 o'clock, Emma quietly slipped away from the ballroom. She walked straight to the reception desk. Grandma. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. I reached across the counter and gently squeezed her hand. You have nothing to apologize for. They're lying. No, I answered softly. They're rewriting. There is a difference. Emma looked toward the ballroom doors. I heard something. That caught my attention. What did you hear? She hesitated. Dad was talking to those 2 investors. My stomach tightened. They think you'll announce something tonight. What? They said once the paperwork is signed, they'll close the inn for renovations. I felt the blood drain from my face. Renovations? That wasn't Richard's dream. That wasn't even Daniel's real plan. What kind of renovations? Emma swallowed. They weren't talking about renovations. They were talking about demolition. For a second, I couldn't hear the music anymore. Only Richard's voice. We're not buying a building. We're saving a story. Emma continued. They want luxury vacation homes. They said wealthy buyers would pay millions for the land. Millions. So that was it. Not preserving history. Not improving the business. Destroying it. Everything suddenly made sense. The investors. The speeches. The word property. The sudden urgency. Daniel had never wanted to run the Ashcroft Inn. He wanted to erase it. He simply needed one signature before he could. Mine. At that exact moment, Daniel walked into the lobby. He smiled the instant he saw us. There you are. He looked almost cheerful. The mayor wants a family photograph. Family. The word sounded almost amusing now. I nodded politely. I'll be there in a minute. He glanced toward my leather handbag, resting beneath the reception desk. Still carrying paperwork everywhere. I smiled. Old habits. He laughed. You can finally stop worrying about documents. We're family. There it was. The sentence people use when they hope you'll stop reading the fine print. He stepped closer. You know, there are developers interested in expanding the property. I never wanted to burden you with business discussions. But now might be the perfect time. I said nothing. He mistook silence for agreement. The offers are extraordinary. You deserve to enjoy retirement. No maintenance. No staffing problems. No repairs. Just peace of mind. Peace of mind. Interesting. People selling something dangerous often package it as comfort. And Rebecca, I asked. She deserves security. Daniel smiled confidently. Exactly. Imagine what this place is worth. Worth. Again. Never once. History. Never once. Richard. Never once. Community. Only value. Only money. Only land. I looked directly into his eyes. For the first time that evening, I saw no trace of the charming businessman everyone admired. Only a real estate salesman calculating commissions. He smiled again. So, did you bring those papers tonight? I rested one hand lightly on my handbag. I did. His eyes brightened. Excellent. I had a feeling tonight would be the perfect evening. It was, I replied. But probably not for the reason you think. He frowned slightly. Before he could answer, the ballroom doors opened. The master of ceremonies picked up the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, We now invite Mrs. Judith Mercer to join us on stage. Daniel smiled. Looks like they're finally giving you the recognition you deserve. I picked up my handbag. For the first time that night, I intended to walk onto that stage. Not to celebrate, to tell the truth. And hidden inside my bag was the one document that could destroy every plan Daniel had spent years building. I walked toward the ballroom carrying nothing but my handbag. 200 people turned to watch. The applause was warm, almost affectionate. If they had known what was about to happen, the room would have been silent long before I reached the stage. The master of ceremonies smiled. Tonight, we'd like to recognize the woman whose dedication helped preserve one of Vermont's most beloved landmarks. He handed me the microphone. Daniel stood a few feet away, already smiling for the cameras. Rebecca smiled too. She expected a sentimental speech. A few tears. Perhaps a toast to Richard. Instead, I looked around the room for a long moment. Then I spoke. My husband used to say that old buildings don't survive because they're made of stronger wood. They survive because every generation chooses to protect them. The room became quiet. When Richard and I bought this in 42 years ago, people told us we were making the biggest mistake of our lives. They weren't entirely wrong. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. We had no money. The roof leaked. The heating failed every winter. There were nights when we wondered whether we'd lose everything. I looked toward the stone fireplace. But every repaired floorboard, every painted wall, every wedding, every anniversary, every guest who returned, made it worthwhile. Many of the older guests nodded. Some smiled through tears. Then my voice changed. Tonight, I came here planning to give my family a gift. Rebecca looked at me. Daniel's smile became uncertain. I slowly opened my handbag. The ballroom was completely silent. I removed the thick blue folder. This folder contains legal documents I spent the last 8 months preparing. I intended to sign them after dinner. Daniel's face lost its color. Rebecca looked confused. What documents? Someone asked. I answered calmly. A permanent historic preservation trust. Several members of the Historical Society leaned forward. I planned to guarantee that the Ashcroft Inn would never be demolished. It would never become luxury housing. It would never be sold to developers. A murmur spread across the room. I continued. My daughter would become managing director. My granddaughter Emma would one day inherit responsibility for protecting the inn. It was the greatest gift, Richard, and I could leave our family. Rebecca covered her mouth. Daniel took one slow step toward me. Judith. I raised one hand. He stopped. Unfortunately, I discovered tonight that not everyone shares Richard's dream. No one moved. No one spoke. I turned toward Daniel. I accidentally overheard a conversation earlier this evening. You weren't discussing preserving the inn. You were discussing selling the land. Daniel forced a nervous laugh. That's not what. I interrupted him. You also told investors that I would sign. Another silence. This one was different. Heavy. The mayor slowly turned toward Daniel. One of the investors looked genuinely uncomfortable. I reached into the folder again. Instead of removing the trust agreement, I removed a single sheet of paper. Richard's handwriting. I found this letter 6 months after my husband died. My voice softened. He wrote it years ago. I unfolded the page. If the Ashcroft Inn ever becomes more valuable as land than as a home, promise me you'll remember why we bought it. Buildings can be rebuilt. Family names can recover. But once history is sold, it never comes back. No one made a sound. Even the musicians stood motionless. I folded the letter carefully. Then I looked directly at Rebecca. I wanted tonight to be the happiest evening of my life. I wanted to hand you this future. I believed you wanted to protect what your father built. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Mom, I know. I nodded gently. I know you didn't write those documents. I also know you stood beside the man who wanted me to. She lowered her head. I'm sorry. The words barely escaped her lips. Not because she wanted the property. Because she had finally understood what she'd lost. Daniel stepped forward. This is completely inappropriate. This isn't the place. No, I replied calmly. This is exactly the place. You chose this room to rewrite 42 years of history. It seems fair that the truth should be told here as well. Applause broke out. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just honest. It started with Mrs. Henderson. Then the Historical Society. Then the mayor. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Not for me. For Richard. For the inn. For the truth. Daniel looked around the room. For the first time since I'd known him. He had nothing to say. I closed the folder. The trust will not be signed tonight. Several people gasped. I continued before anyone could misunderstand. It will be revised. I spent too many years in probate court to reward assumptions. I've learned that stewardship is earned. Not expected. Then I looked at Emma. She was crying openly. Smiling through every tear. Emma, I said. One day, if you still love this place for what it is instead of what it's worth, it will be yours to protect. She nodded without speaking. That was enough. 6 months later, Daniel filed for divorce. It turned out he'd been negotiating with developers long before the anniversary celebration. Rebecca came to my house alone. No speeches. No excuses. Just truth. She admitted she'd allowed herself to believe that convenience mattered more than gratitude. That protecting her marriage had become easier than protecting her father's legacy. Real apologies are quiet. They don't ask for immediate forgiveness. They simply accept responsibility. I forgave her slowly. Trust returns much more slowly than tears. A year later, we signed a new trust. Not the original one. A better one. The Ashcroft Inn would remain protected forever. No future spouse could sell it. No developer could touch it. No financial crisis could erase it. Emma was named the future steward of the property, but only if she agreed to preserve its history exactly as Richard intended. Every anniversary since then, we gather in the same ballroom. There are no reserved tables. No special seating. No speeches about ownership. Only one tradition remains. Before dinner begins, someone rings the old brass bell at the front desk. Then we remember Richard's favorite sentence. We're not protecting a building. We're protecting the stories people leave inside it. I spent decades believing that inheritance meant giving people everything you built. Now I know better. An inheritance isn't property. It isn't money. It isn't land. It's responsibility. And responsibility belongs only to those who understand the difference between owning a place and belonging to it.